My wedding day began quietly, the kind of quiet that feels almost sacred. Early morning light filtered through the curtains of the hotel room, pale and gentle, landing on the dress hanging from the closet door. It looked unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. I stood there for a moment, barefoot on the carpet, breathing in the faint smell of flowers and hairspray, telling myself to stay present. This was the day everything was supposed to come together. When I arrived at the venue, the vineyard looked exactly the way we'd imagined it. Rows of green vines stretched into the distance, the air cool and clean, the chairs arranged neatly along the aisle. Guests were beginning to arrive, voices low and excited, sunlight catching on glass and fabric. It felt full, alive. Then I saw the chairs on the left. They were marked with a small sign that read family, front row, carefully reserved. We had chosen those seats with intention, imagining familiar faces filling them, people who had known me long before this version of myself existed. I slowed without meaning to, my eyes scanning them once, then again. They were empty. Not a single jacket draped over the back. No purses on the ground. No whispered conversations or last-minute adjustments. Just a row of pristine white chairs sitting untouched, as if they were part of the decor rather than meant for real people. For a brief second my mind tried to correct the image. Maybe they were running late. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. But deep down I already knew. The absence felt too clean, too intentional. On the other side of the aisle, my partner's family filled their seats easily. Parents, siblings, relatives leaning in close, smiling, wiping at their eyes. Everything about that side looked the way a wedding is supposed to look. The contrast was sharp enough to sting. Music began to play. Someone touched my arm gently, guiding me forward. I walked down the aisle with my head up and a practiced smile, aware of every step, every breath. I did not stop. I did not turn back, but the empty chairs stayed with me the entire time, quiet and undeniable. As I stood there, saying my vows, I understood something with absolute clarity. The real story of this day didn't end with the ceremony. It started with those empty chairs, and what happened after everyone else went home. The empty chairs didn't come out of nowhere. They were the final result of a decision that had already been made days earlier, sealed quietly in a text message I still remember word for word. It arrived the morning of the wedding, while my hair was half pinned and the makeup artist was asking me to tilt my chin. My phone buzzed on the table beside a glass of water and my bouquet. I glanced at the screen without urgency, assuming it was a last-minute check-in or a reassurance. It was my mom. "We'll celebrate later, honey. Your brother's Hawaii trip is already booked." That was all. No apology, no hesitation. Just a neat, composed sentence that landed like a slap. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, reading it again as if the meaning might soften the second time. My mind rushed to fill in gaps she hadn't bothered to explain. Maybe they'd come late. Maybe they were flying back early. Maybe she meant something else entirely. But even as I stood there in my wedding dress, I knew the truth. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't bad timing. It was a choice. A week earlier, my brother had mentioned the trip casually, laughing about the deal he'd found on flights. He talked about how much he needed the break, how the stress had been getting to him. When I reminded him about the wedding date, he brushed it off like it was a minor inconvenience. Vacations couldn't be moved, he said. The flights were non-refundable. I would understand. I didn't understand. I just hoped my mother would. When I called her after reading the text, her tone was calm, almost distracted. She repeated the same reasoning as if she'd practiced it. "The trip was expensive. Your brother works so hard. We can do something nice later. A dinner, a celebration." As though the day I was getting married could be folded neatly into some undefined future weekend. What made it worse wasn't just the decision itself, it was the timing. Knowing that while guests were already arriving, while I was standing there in my dress, she had chosen to finalize her absence with a sentence that left no room for discussion. I ended the call quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I thanked the makeup artist and sat still while she finished her work. But inside, something shifted. The disbelief gave way to a slow, sinking realization. They weren't missing my wedding. They were skipping it. From the outside, I know how it sounds. One missed event. One bad decision. I could already hear the explanations people would offer on my family's behalf, the ones meant to smooth things over and make the situation feel smaller than it was. Families are complicated. Things happen. You can't always be everywhere at once. But this wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about timing or money or flights. It was about meaning. I am my mother's only daughter. Growing up, I believed that came with a certain understanding, a quiet promise that there would be moments in my life that mattered simply because they were mine. Moments where I wouldn't need to compete, compromise, or make myself easier to accommodate someone else's needs. My wedding was supposed to be one of those moments. It wasn't just a ceremony or a party we planned for months. It was a threshold. A day that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A moment that exists once and then becomes a memory you carry for the rest of your life. You don't get a redo. You don't reschedule it when it's convenient. When my mother chose a vacation over being there, it reframed everything I had tried so hard not to question. My relationship with my brother had always been defined by imbalance. He was the one who needed more attention, more understanding, more flexibility. His struggles were treated like emergencies. Mine were treated like proof that I was strong enough to handle things on my own. For years, I accepted that narrative. I told myself it was normal, that families have different roles, that being the easy one was something to be proud of. Standing at the altar without them, that story fell apart. The hurt didn't come from being alone in that moment. I was surrounded by people who loved me. It came from realizing that the absence was intentional. That when faced with a clear choice between showing up for me or preserving my brother's comfort, the decision had been easy. That clarity was devastating. It reached back into childhood memories I had minimized and forward into a future I suddenly saw more clearly. It forced me to confront the possibility that this wasn't an exception to the rule. It was the rule itself, finally exposed in a way I could no longer excuse. As I stood there, holding my partner's hands and saying my vows, I felt two truths exist side by side. I was deeply loved by the family I was choosing, and I was finally seeing the family I came from for what it truly was. That realization hurt far more than any empty chair ever could. Once I stopped treating the wedding as an isolated wound, a pattern I had spent years avoiding came into focus with uncomfortable clarity. My brother hadn't just been chosen that time, he had always been chosen. Growing up, his needs were the ones that shaped the household. If he was upset, plans changed. If he was tired, expectations softened. If he failed, there was a reason, an explanation, a second chance already prepared for him. When he succeeded, it was celebrated loudly, as proof that he was destined for something big. I learned early how to make myself smaller around that gravity. It showed up in ways that seemed minor at the time. His birthday parties were events, themes, guests, photos taken from every angle. Mine were quieter, often adjusted to whatever else was happening that week. If something conflicted, my celebration moved, his never did. When money was tight, his interests were protected. Mine were described as optional. As teenagers, the imbalance became more polished. He needed help because he was under pressure. I was told I was independent, capable, resilient. Those words sounded like praise until I realized they were also a permission slip for everyone else to disengage. If I struggled, it was proof I could handle it. If he struggled, it was proof he needed support. Adulthood didn't change the dynamic, it just gave it better excuses. When my brother felt burned out, the family rallied around the importance of rest and mental health. When he wanted to travel, it was framed as necessary, restorative, non-negotiable. His life was described as demanding, his stress as exceptional. Any inconvenience caused by his choices was something the rest of us were expected to absorb quietly. My life, on the other hand, was flexible by default. I adjusted schedules, I compromised plans. I learned to soften my reactions so I wouldn't be labeled difficult. If I expressed disappointment, it was met with reminders of how much worse things could be, how fortunate I was, how understanding I should be. The message was always the same: I could bend, so I should. Over time, those small adjustments built a hierarchy so familiar that it felt invisible. He stood at the center, my mother orbiting closely around him, anticipating his needs, protecting his comfort. I existed just outside that circle, included as long as I didn't disrupt the balance. The wedding didn't create that hierarchy, it exposed it. Choosing his vacation over my wedding wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the logical outcome of years spent reinforcing whose time mattered more. My once-in-a-lifetime moment was treated as movable, because I had always been the one expected to move. Seeing it laid out so plainly was unsettling, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. I stopped wondering how I could have explained things better or been more accommodating. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I had been adapting my entire life to a system that was never designed. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with conversations that left me more drained than any planning detail ever could. On the surface, nothing sounded openly cruel. The words were soft, reasonable, almost caring. That was what made them so effective. My mom called often, her tone carefully measured. She spoke about how stressful things had been for my brother lately, how hard he'd been working, how much this trip meant to him. She reminded me of the cost of the flights, the hotel, the planning already done. Every sentence landed with the same underlying message: this situation was unfortunate, but understandable, and my role was to make it easier. When I tried to explain why it hurt, she pivoted quickly. She said I was focusing too much on myself. She said a wedding is just one day, but family harmony lasts a lifetime. She asked why I couldn't be more flexible, more compassionate, more supportive. Each question was framed as concern, but it carried an accusation beneath it. If I pushed back, even gently, she reframed my reaction as selfishness. She said I was creating unnecessary drama, that I was choosing to be hurt instead of choosing peace. The implication was clear: my feelings were the real problem here, not the decision that caused them. My brother echoed her logic in his own way. He told me I was overthinking things, that people miss weddings all the time, that anyone who really loved me would understand why he couldn't give up this trip. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been asked to sacrifice anything meaningful himself. What made it worse was how familiar this all felt. I had heard these arguments before, just in different forms. I recognized the way my discomfort was being minimized, reshaped, and handed back to me as a flaw in my character. I was being asked to manage everyone else's feelings while quietly setting my own aside. At some point, I stopped trying to explain myself clearly. Not because I suddenly agreed with them, but because I realized clarity wasn't the issue. They understood what they were asking of me. They just didn't believe my pain outweighed my brother's convenience. By the time the wedding week arrived, I felt worn down. Not angry, not hysterical, just tired. Tired of justifying why my own milestones mattered. Tired of being told that asking for basic presents was unreasonable. In those quiet moments, sitting alone with my thoughts, I noticed something else creeping in alongside the exhaustion. A small, steady awareness that I had been carrying this responsibility for far too long. That being understanding had become another word for disappearing. I didn't know yet what I would do with that realization, but it stayed with me, waiting for its moment. The ceremony moved forward whether I was ready or not. Guests filled the rows, music swelled softly through the vineyard, and the late afternoon light settled into that warm, golden tone photographers love. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Up close, I felt every missing piece. As I stood just out of sight, waiting for my cue, people passed by offering quick smiles and gentle touches on my arm. Some avoided my eyes altogether. Others looked at me a second too long, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle without asking the obvious question. Where are your parents? Where is your family? I learned very quickly how to answer without really answering. Travel issues, scheduling problems, something vague enough to shut the conversation down without inviting sympathy or judgment. Each time I said it, the words felt heavier in my mouth. When the music changed and it was time to walk down the aisle, there was a brief pause that stretched longer than it should have. The officiant looked around instinctively, waiting for someone to step forward. No one did. There was no announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet, awkward gap where a familiar ritual should have been. My partner's father stepped in without hesitation. He offered his arm gently, his expression kind and steady, as if to say, "I've got you." I nodded, grateful and heartbroken all at once. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was practical, necessary, and that somehow made it hurt more. As I walked, I kept my eyes forward. I focused on the sound of my footsteps against the ground, the feel of the fabric brushing my legs, the way my partner's face softened when he saw me. I didn't look at the empty chairs again. I didn't trust myself to. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The words were sincere. The promises felt real. When we said our vows, I meant every one of them. I held on to the warmth of the moment, the life we were choosing to build together, the people who had shown up for us without conditions. Still, the absence hovered quietly in the background. Afterward, during the reception, it surfaced in small, unexpected ways. A distant relative asking if my parents were running late, a friend's mother squeezing my hand a little too tightly, someone offering congratulations followed by an awkward pause. I smiled. I thanked people. I danced. I laughed when I was supposed to. From the outside, I looked composed, even joyful. Inside, I was holding two truths at once. I was genuinely happy to be married, and I was deeply aware that something irreparable had happened. As the night went on and the celebration slowly wound down, I felt a strange sense of suspension, like the story hadn't finished unfolding yet, like the real consequences of this day were still somewhere ahead of me, waiting for the right moment to surface. I didn't know what they would look like, but I knew this wasn't the end. The days after the wedding passed in a blur of thank you notes, returned rentals, and quiet mornings that felt heavier than they should have. Life was moving forward, but something inside me lagged behind, still stuck on that empty row of chairs. My mom called a few days later, her voice light, almost cheerful. She talked about the trip as if it were a harmless inconvenience, mentioning the weather in Hawaii, the view from their hotel, how relaxed my brother seemed. Before I could say anything, she added, "We'll celebrate you properly when we're all together. We'll plan something nice." Later became her favorite word. Later meant no date, no plan, no acknowledgement of what had already been lost. It was a placeholder meant to smooth over discomfort without ever addressing it. When I asked what she had in mind, she changed the subject. When I mentioned how painful it had been not to have them there, she told me I was holding on to things too tightly. Meanwhile, the images started appearing online, photos of beaches and cocktails, smiling group shots. My brother posted a picture of the sunset with a caption about family time and resetting priorities. My mother commented with hearts and inside jokes. There was no mention of the wedding they had missed. No acknowledgement of where they were supposed to be instead. Watching it unfold felt surreal. It was like they had stepped into a version of reality where my absence didn't require explanation, where the narrative could simply move forward, unbothered by the gap they had left behind. When I didn't respond with enthusiasm, my mother framed my distance as moodiness. She told relatives I was probably just overwhelmed, that weddings are emotional, that I'd come around. The story shifted subtly but deliberately. My hurt became an overreaction. Their choice became a misunderstanding. I noticed myself pulling back without making a conscious decision to do so. I answered messages more slowly. I stopped offering updates about my life. I listened more than I spoke. It wasn't punishment, it was self-preservation. The more they tried to gloss over what happened, the clearer it became that accountability wasn't coming. They wanted resolution without responsibility, closure without discomfort. They wanted me to help rewrite the story in a way that let everyone off the hook. For the first time, I didn't rush to do that work for them. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how easily my absence from their lives was explained away, how quickly they adapted to not having to consider my feelings. That realization was painful, but it was also grounding. It stripped away the last layer of confusion. This wasn't about a missed celebration. It was about a family that expected me to absorb the damage quietly, then smile and move on. And as the weeks passed, something in me began to harden, not into anger, but into clarity. I was done pretending nothing had happened. The shift didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no final argument that changed everything. It happened quietly, in the space left behind when I stopped trying so hard. I realized one morning that I hadn't rehearsed a response in my head before calling my mother back. I hadn't planned how to explain my feelings in a way that might finally make sense to her. The urge to clarify, to justify, to soften everything so no one felt uncomfortable, it just wasn't there anymore. At first, that absence felt unsettling. I had spent so long believing that if I could just find the right words, the right tone, the right amount of patience, things would shift. That she would understand. That my brother would see the impact of his choices. That the family would correct itself. Letting go of that belief was painful, but it was also strangely relieving. Without the constant effort to manage their reactions, I started seeing the situation more clearly. The pattern wasn't hidden anymore. It was consistent and predictable. My role had always been to absorb disappointment quietly, to make adjustments so others didn't have to, and to accept whatever version of the story kept the peace. Once I saw that, it was hard to unsee. I noticed how my mother spoke to me only when it suited her, how conversations revolved around my brother's plans and moods, how my life became background noise unless it required something from me. I noticed how rarely anyone asked how I was doing, not in a surface way, but in a way that left room for an honest answer. Instead of reacting, I started observing. I let messages sit unanswered longer. I responded without over-explaining. I stopped filling silences with reassurance. It wasn't intentional at first. It just felt necessary. Like my nervous system was finally getting a break from years of vigilance. Emotionally, I began to step back. Not in a cold or cruel way, but with distance. I stopped measuring my worth against their attention. I stopped hoping the next conversation would be different. I accepted, for the first time, that the relationship I wanted with my family might not be available to me. That acceptance came with grief. I mourned the version of my mother I had hoped would show up. I mourned the idea of a balanced sibling relationship that never really existed. I mourned the effort I had poured into trying to make myself easier to love. But beneath that grief was something steadier. A growing sense that I didn't need to keep proving anything. That my pain didn't require their validation to be real. That I was allowed to stop engaging in a cycle that left me drained and diminished. By the time months had passed since the wedding, I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I was waiting to see what would happen when I stopped chasing one. The invitation arrived months later, tucked inside a thick envelope with carefully chosen paper and my mother's familiar handwriting on the front. I recognized it instantly. She always wrote my name the same way, rounded letters, deliberate, as if presentation alone could soften whatever message followed. Inside was an announcement for my brother's upcoming wedding celebration. Destination: multi-day events. A schedule that made it clear this wasn't just a ceremony, it was an experience. Welcome dinner, group activities, a final brunch, everything thoughtfully planned, everything presented as important. At the bottom, in smaller print, there was a handwritten note from my mother. It would mean so much to the family if you were there. I read it twice, then set it down on the table without reacting. The irony wasn't subtle. It didn't need interpretation. Months earlier, my wedding had been treated as flexible, something that could be postponed or replaced with a dinner later. Now, I was being asked, expected, to show up fully for an event built around my brother, one that required travel, time off, and emotional presence. The assumption underneath it all was familiar. Of course I would come. Of course I would rearrange my life. Of course I would be understanding. My mother followed up with a call that same evening, her voice warm and upbeat, as if the past hadn't happened. She talked about fresh starts, about how nice it would be to have everyone together, about how families heal when they show up for each other. She spoke in broad, comforting phrases, never once mentioning the wedding she had skipped when the hurt she had dismissed. When I asked, calmly, if she understood why this invitation felt complicated for me, there was a pause. Then she sighed and said she didn't want to reopen old wounds, that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy, that this was a chance to move forward. My brother texted shortly after. His message was casual, almost rehearsed. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings, that life overlaps sometimes, that he really wanted me there for his big day. He framed it as generosity, as if inviting me was an olive branch rather than an expectation. I felt the pressure building in small, precise ways. Relatives asking if I'd booked my flight yet. My mother mentioning how awkward it would look if I wasn't there. Subtle reminders that my absence would raise questions. What struck me most wasn't their request. It was their certainty. They were so sure I would comply that they never stopped to consider what they were actually asking of me. They hadn't repaired anything. They hadn't acknowledged what they'd done. They simply assumed access. Sitting there with the invitation in front of me, I understood something with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about attendance, it was a test. A quiet measure of whether I would continue playing the role they were most comfortable with, or whether the balance had finally shifted. I didn't respond right away, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to answer from a place that was steady, not reactive. For the first time, there was no internal debate pulling me in opposite directions. The decision had already settled quietly inside me. A few days later, my mom called again. Her tone was gentle, almost cheerful, as if momentum alone could carry us past anything uncomfortable. She asked if I'd looked at flights. She mentioned how nice it would be to have family photos, how much it would mean to my brother. She spoke as though my presence was already decided, just waiting to be confirmed. I listened without interrupting. When she finally paused, I said it calmly, evenly, without explanation or apology. I'm not going. There was a brief silence on the line. Not anger, not sadness, confusion. The kind that comes when a familiar pattern suddenly breaks. She laughed softly at first, like she thought I was joking or being dramatic. Then she said I must be overwhelmed, that we could talk about it later when things were less emotional. I repeated myself just as calmly as before. Not this time. The words felt surprisingly light when I said them. Not heavy, not cruel, just true. She asked why. I didn't give her a speech. I didn't rehash the wedding. I didn't defend my feelings or list examples. I told her simply that I wasn't able to show up for this, and that my decision was final. That was when the tone shifted. She told me I was being unfair, that holding on to the past was unhealthy, that family shows up for each other even when things aren't perfect. Each sentence was familiar, well worn, designed to pull me back into my old role. The one where I softened, reconsidered, and made space for everyone else. I didn't. I let her finish. I acknowledged that she was disappointed, and then I said I hoped the event was everything they wanted it to be. When my brother texted later, his message was shorter, sharper. He said he couldn't believe I'd do this to him. That it was petty. That I was choosing to create distance when things could finally be normal again. I read it once and didn't respond. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction, it was my own. There was no spike of guilt, no urge to fix things, no instinct to smooth the edges. I felt grounded, almost detached, like I was standing just outside a room I'd spent my whole life trapped inside. Saying no didn't come with fireworks or relief. It came with a quiet certainty. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating my place in the family. I was choosing myself, and letting the consequences unfold without interference. The fallout began almost immediately, just not all at once. It arrived in waves, each one carrying a familiar emotional weight I'd spent years learning how to absorb. First came the messages. My mother sent long texts that mixed disappointment with accusation. She said she couldn't believe I would choose to hurt the family this way. She reminded me of everything she had done for me growing up. Every sacrifice she believed counted as proof that I owed her understanding now. She framed my decision as punishment, as if saying no was an act of aggression rather than self-protection. A few hours later, another message followed, softer in tone but sharper in implication. She wrote that relatives were already asking questions. That people would talk. That my absence would embarrass her and my brother. The responsibility for managing that discomfort was quietly handed back to me, just as it always had been. My brother's response was less polished. He accused me of being petty. He said I was holding a grudge over something small and blowing it out of proportion. He claimed I was trying to make a point at his expense. In his version of events, I wasn't reacting to a pattern. I was creating one. What struck me was how quickly the narrative shifted. The wedding was no longer mentioned. The empty chairs disappeared from the story entirely. Instead, the focus became my refusal, my boundaries, my supposed lack of maturity. They spoke as though the timeline began the moment I said no, erasing everything that had led up to it. Relatives joined in indirectly. I received messages that sounded neutral on the surface, but carried pressure underneath. Your mom is really upset. This is tearing the family apart. You only get one family. Each sentence was a reminder of my old role. Absorb the discomfort so everyone else can relax. I noticed something else too. No one asked how I felt. No one acknowledged why this might be hard for me. The concern was entirely outward-facing, how it looked, how it affected them, how quickly it could be resolved if I just gave in. For the first time, I didn't engage. I didn't argue. I didn't correct their version of events. I didn't send paragraphs explaining myself. I responded briefly when necessary and stayed silent when I didn't have the energy. The more space I created, the more frantic their attempts became. They tried urgency, then guilt, then moral language about forgiveness and family unity. Each tactic felt less about reconciliation and more about regaining control. Watching it from a distance was unsettling. It exposed how much of my value in the family had been tied to compliance. The moment I stepped out of that role, the system pushed back hard. But something had changed. The pressure that once would have folded me inward now slid past without taking root. I could see the manipulation for what it was, not proof that I was wrong, but proof that my absence from the role was being felt. And I stayed exactly where I was. Once the initial storm passed, something quieter took its place. The constant messages slowed, the urgency dulled, and in that space, the first real consequences began to surface. Not as dramatic confrontations, but as subtle fractures spreading through the family structure. Without my automatic compliance, things didn't move as smoothly anymore. I heard about it indirectly at first. A cousin mentioned how tense a recent family dinner had felt. Someone else noted that my mother seemed distracted, irritable, less in control of the room than usual. Conversations that used to flow easily now stalled, missing the person who had always filled the gaps, smoothed over discomfort, and redirected attention when things got awkward. I realized that person had been me. For years, I had unknowingly carried a significant amount of emotional labor. I was the one who remembered birthdays, checked in after arguments, reframed comments so no one felt attacked. I was the buffer between personalities that clashed and expectations that never aligned. When I stepped back, there was no one to quietly take my place. My mother struggled with that absence more than she admitted. Without me there to absorb her frustration or validate her perspective, she had fewer places to put it. She complained more openly, and people listened less patiently. The sympathy she expected didn't come as easily once there was no daughter stepping in to quietly take responsibility. My brother felt it too. He was used to having someone accommodate him without question. Someone who adjusted schedules, softened conflicts, and made sure things worked out in his favor. Without that, his demands landed differently. They sounded sharper, less reasonable. People began to push back in small ways they never had before. There were moments of social discomfort that couldn't be brushed aside. Questions about why I wasn't attending events lingered longer than anyone expected. Explanations felt thinner each time they were repeated. The story my family had been telling, that I was simply busy or emotional, started to lose credibility. What surprised me most was how little I needed to do for this shift to happen. I didn't confront anyone publicly. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't try to expose anything. I simply stayed consistent. I didn't show up where I wasn't respected. I didn't take on roles that drained me. I didn't rush in to fix discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. Over time, the imbalance became harder to ignore. People noticed how much effort had been placed on protecting my brother's comfort, and how little had been extended to me. Without my presence to normalize it, the favoritism stood out more starkly. The hierarchy that had once felt invisible now looked deliberate. From my side, the distance brought clarity. I slept better. Conversations felt lighter. I wasn't bracing myself before every interaction or replaying them afterward. I didn't feel guilty for not doing more, because I could finally see how much I had already done. The family didn't collapse overnight. That wasn't how it worked. But the foundation shifted. Small cracks widened. The structure began adjusting to the absence of the person who had held it together without recognition. And for the first time, I wasn't tempted to rush back in and repair it. I let it stand as it was, trusting that whatever happened next was no longer my responsibility to manage. Time did what arguments never could. It removed the urgency, the defensiveness, the ability to blame everything on one emotional moment. With distance, patterns had nowhere to hide. Over the next year, the cracks that had begun to form widened slowly and unevenly. My brother's wedding happened as planned. From what filtered back to me, it looked beautiful on the surface. Carefully curated photos, smiling faces, captions about family and new beginnings. But beneath that polish, things were already strained. The celebration had stretched finances thin. My parents had helped more than they could afford, quietly reassuring themselves it was temporary, that things would balance out later. They always believed things would eventually balance out. They had believed that for years. My brother struggled with the shift in attention after the wedding. Without a major event to orbit around, his frustrations surfaced more openly. He complained about pressure, about expectations, about how people didn't support him the way they used to. The problem was, people were listening differently now. Without me translating his moods into something more palatable, his entitlement landed plainly. Small disagreements turned into larger ones. His marriage, built under the same assumptions of accommodation, began showing strain, the same patterns that had once worked in his favor. Deflection, emotional reliance, avoidance, created tension when no one rushed in to smooth them over. Arguments lingered instead of dissolving. Resentments had space to grow. My parents felt the shift in subtler ways. Social invitations slowed. Conversations with relatives felt shorter, less warm. People remembered Hawaii. They remembered my absence from the wedding that followed. The explanations my mother had offered no longer carried the same weight. Without a willing scapegoat to absorb blame, accountability hovered uncomfortably close. What stood out most was how quiet it all became. There were fewer group messages, fewer enthusiastic updates. When my mother called, her tone was less confident, more brittle. She complained more often about feeling unappreciated, about how hard everything felt lately. I listened when I had the energy. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't step back into the role of fixer. From a distance, I could see how much of the family's stability had depended on my willingness to bend. Without that flexibility, the system didn't explode, but it sagged under its own weight. Every unresolved issue stayed unresolved. Every poor decision carried forward instead of being softened by someone else's effort. There was no dramatic downfall, no single moment where everything collapsed, just consequences accumulating quietly. Meanwhile, my life continued moving forward, not in grand leaps but in steady, grounding ways. My relationships felt more balanced. My time felt like it belonged to me. I wasn't measuring my choices against how they might be received or misinterpreted. I noticed something else, too. The guilt I had once carried so reflexively had begun to fade. Not because I convinced myself I was right, but because reality had done the work for me. The outcomes spoke for themselves. The distance I'd created hadn't destroyed my family. It had simply stopped me from holding together something that was already coming apart. And as uncomfortable as that truth was, it confirmed what I had known since the moment I said no. The unraveling wasn't caused by my boundaries. It was caused by years of choices finally being allowed to stand on their own. While things were slowly unraveling on one side, something else was taking shape on the other. Quietly, steadily, without conditions. The people who had shown up for my wedding continued to show up afterward, not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to. My partner's parents checked in regularly, not with probing questions or expectations, but with genuine interest. They asked how I was settling into married life, what we were excited about, what we needed. When they offered help, it came without strings attached. Friends filled in spaces I hadn't realized were empty. A close friend invited me over one evening just to sit on the couch and decompress. No agenda, no advice unless I asked for it. Another sent messages on days she knew were hard, not to fix anything, just to remind me I wasn't alone. There was an ease to these relationships that felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious, until I realized it was simply what mutual care looked like. Even some extended relatives, ones I hadn't been particularly close to before, reached out quietly. They didn't demand explanations. They didn't push reconciliation. They acknowledged what had happened in simple, honest ways. "I'm glad you did what you needed to do. You deserved better." Those sentences landed gently, without pressure to respond a certain way. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, love had always come with expectations: be understanding, be flexible, don't make things difficult. On the other, presence came freely. People didn't need me to perform gratitude or forgiveness to earn their support. They didn't ask me to minimize my own experience to protect theirs. Over time, that consistency created stability. My nervous system relaxed. Conversations felt lighter. I didn't second-guess myself after every interaction. I trusted that if something felt off, I could say so without it becoming a referendum on my character. My partner noticed the change before I did. He told me I seemed more grounded, less guarded, that I laughed more easily, that I no longer braced myself before family-related topics came up. It wasn't that the past stopped mattering, it just stopped dictating my present. I realized then that chosen family isn't about replacement, it's about alignment. It's about building a circle where care flows in both directions, where showing up isn't a currency to be spent later. For the first time, I wasn't defining family by obligation or proximity. I was defining it by presence, consistency, and respect. And that made all the difference. The final boundary didn't come with an announcement. There was no dramatic declaration, no speech explaining my decision. It showed up in what I stopped doing. I stopped chasing conversations that went nowhere. I stopped offering access to parts of my life that were met with indifference or entitlement. I stopped waiting for apologies that were never going to arrive in a form that mattered. What surprised me most was how little explanation was required once I truly accepted that I didn't need their understanding to move forward. I didn't cut anyone off out of anger. I didn't rewrite the past to make myself feel justified. I simply decided, with clarity and calm, what I was no longer willing to participate in. Some relationships shifted into limited contact, others faded naturally. I let that happen without trying to rescue them. There were moments of doubt, of course. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But each time I honored my own boundary, the doubt softened. Each time I chose peace over obligation, I felt more solid in myself. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could endure or how well I could keep things together. I stopped mistaking self-sacrifice for love. I learned that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't require an audience. It's quiet, consistent, and rooted in truth. The family I came from may never fully acknowledge what happened. They may continue telling a version of the story where my absence is the problem. I've made peace with that. Their narrative no longer defines me. What defines me now is the life I chose to build, one where my presence is valued, my boundaries are respected, and my worth isn't negotiable. If you've ever been told to be understanding at the expense of your own well-being, I hope you hear this clearly. Choosing yourself is not cruelty. It's honesty. And sometimes, the most powerful response isn't revenge or confrontation. It's a simple, unwavering decision to step into a life that no longer requires you to disappear.